Well, I mean, he's in character the whole way. As long as he doesn't pull an axe or something, I think we're good. Want to jump up here at the front?
Sure. My name's Adele. I'm a librarian.
Who doesn't know?
I'm Daniel. I work over at Odyssey House on the street.
Excellent.
I'm Katie.
Elizabeth, or Catwoman.
Catwoman or Elizabeth.
Ed.
On the back.
I'm Rita, and I'm here from California.
Oh, excellent.
I'm Joubert, and I'm here from California.
We've never had anybody come this far for a dialogue.
I know,
so.
isn't it wonderful?
I know, it was a record.
We got here.
That's right. Welcome to New Orleans. Tanya,
I'm Tanya Harris. Hello.
all the way from the night ward.
That's right.
That's right.
I'm Z.
She is the manager at Fairgrounds, so I'm sure many of you have seen her before.
I'm Beth.
Okay.
I bet.
Two Beths, and I'm Wade Rathke with Fairgrounds. So, you ready to go?
Sure.
Okay, Brooke Butler.
Introduce yourself.
Oh,
Oh, hi. Sorry.
no, nothing to be sorry about. Is that your name?
Lauren.
Lauren, welcome. We're just starting. There's seats up here. There's a yellow seat next to California.
California delegation.
The whole time. Well, I know you're really here because you're working for the election in some state that's important. So, no, not quite. Well, good. Okay, on to Voodoo then. That was the politics part. Now we'll get to.
All right. My name is Brooke, as Wade said, and I finished my dissertation and PhD in cultural studies a couple of years ago, and the focus was specifically on New Orleans voodoo and tourism, in which I definitely focused on race and politics throughout the majority of it. And I got this degree at the University of California, so there is a connection too.
Which one?
Davis?
Yeah, right by where I live,
Oh, where are you from?
Sacramento.
Oh, yeah.
Ah, okay,
Great
sure.
school.
Yes. And so in the cultural studies department there, which is great. I ended up getting into voodoo through a master's program though in Southern Studies at University of Mississippi, taking a course on the history of religion in the South. And after reading about 20, 30 books on Protestantism, I wanted to do something that was a little bit different. And I had also just read The Tourist by Dean McCannell. And so I thought, how can I combine these two into something that might be interesting for me to continue to study? And so that's how I got into doing voodoo and tourism. And then when I went on to do my PhD, I actually was focused on in another area, but this subject became really popular and decided to roll. So, and it has been a lot of fun, and I've really enjoyed my research along the way. So, that's me.
Yay!
So now on to the video. Like many of you, probably my first encounters with voodoo were popular perceptions. I think my very first encounter was through a Scooby-Doo episode. And these were these images and the different stories that sort of made up what I knew about voodoo. So going to study it is something that I wanted to do because I didn't really think that the Scooby-Doo sort of genre that I was receiving was the whole story. So what is voodoo? First and foremost, it's religion, but it is also and has definitely served as a form of resistance, and definitely as a unifying agent among a diverse population within the city of New Orleans. The religion itself is composed of African socio-cultural and religious aspects, Native American beliefs and pharmacology, Old and New World folklore, capitalism, and Roman Catholicism. All of these are sort of the hotbed from which New Orleans voodoo sprang. So the first records that we have of voodoo in New Orleans were from tourist accounts. Back in the day, the rich, wealthy men would travel when they came of age, and one such lad, Antoine Simon Lepage du Prats, sorry, my French is horrible, He wrote what is known as like the history of Louisiana, the first history of Louisiana, and in it he mentions various dancings and rituals and musics happening in what we now call Armstrong Park, which was known as Congo Square, La Place de Negres. And even from those early accounts, he and others who were writing travelogues of the sort mentioned that it was something that you must see if you were in New Orleans. It was one of the first tourist attractions of New Orleans. This was something that was a must-see attraction. And however, it was legal and very out in the open for a while, but there was a subversive element at the same time. Voodoo itself was never outlawed in the city of New Orleans, but various aspects of it that made it difficult to practice were outlawed, such as drumming and gathering and divination rites. So even though they never outlawed it, they made it very difficult to practice. Yet, they didn't see, the French colonists weren't necessarily seeing the power and the strength that voodoo had as it was growing in the city. And this largely lent to the paternalism that informed their ideas about slavery, that they were merely helping and bringing civilization to the Native American and Africans that they had captured and enslaved. And if they were to contend that there was anything serious going on within these voodoo rituals and practices, that there may be an element of resistance, that it would negate their ideas about paternalism, so they couldn't acknowledge these. And then when we think about some of the more popular versions of voodoo that we kind of get also out of this era, in the late mid to late 1800s, Lafcadio Hearn was known to sort of bring the image of New Orleans to the rest of the U.S. He was a writer for such publications as Harper's and would write about experiences in the United States, or in New Orleans. And it was the first glimpse that many people around the U.S. got of what the unique situation in New Orleans was. He also wrote about New Orleans voodoo specifically as something that was horrible and a blight upon the city and something that was not good. However, he also was the one who wrote Marie Laveau's obituary for the New York Times, so he might have come around with it. So this is where we're going to get into the Yoruba, going sort of historically looking at the influences that have brought and sort of established what we think of as New Orleans voodoo. In 1719, the first group of slaves was brought to the New Orleans area, and they were largely composed of the Fon, the Ewe, and the Yoruba. These are all neighboring groups in the Bight of Benin area, and they were all very different ethnicities, different languages, very different peoples, but there were some things that they had in common that they discovered as they were being transported and living here. One, that they were captive. That was definitely a huge underlying factor. But also, they had similar spiritual features. Part of their religious makeup and their spiritual beliefs were not exact, but there were similarities that could translate across, and it became a unifying space for them. Several years later, the Bambara then came in as the largest group of Africans enslaved in the New Orleans area. They made up about 2/3 of the population of slaves in the area. They were known to be a warring group, so this was also a very multi-ethnic group, because as they were warring, they would take slaves from the groups that they were warring against, and when they were traveling around, they would often just take slaves from other areas and people that they came upon. So this was a diverse group in itself, but it was known as a strong and a resistant group, often hired out for mercenary work. But they also became, during the slave trade, enslaved and brought to the U.S., specifically into the New Orleans area. And because they were known for their battle skills and for being a strong army and a source of resistance, it is guessed that many other Africans, slaves at the time, would claim or also sort of join into this group and inclusion. But this is also surmised because the record keeping at the time from in recording origins of all the slaves that were brought in was shoddy at best. And so from 1730s to the 1770s, there was a bit of a lull of the slave transport in the New Orleans area. And this allowed this group that was already there to solidify and unify and become a community unto itself. And it was really unusual in the United States amongst slavery for nuclear families and extended families to be able to stay together the way that many were able to in this area, which also helped to unify them as a people and help continue on practices such as voodoo. So, but while they were unifying as a group and sort of making their place in New Orleans, the colonists were having a bit of a hard time exerting their presence here. The French were in power from 1719 to 1763, which is 44 years, not much of a time to get a real foothold of power. And also by 1713, the slave population far outstripped the population of the colonists in the area. Then the Spanish took over from 1763 to 1800, which is just 37 years, so even less than the 44, kind of adding to this disjointedness of the rule. But there was still this very cohesive black community that was enslaved, but making their own presence and cultural presence felt. And then the French got the area back from the 1800 to 1803, whereupon it came to the U.S. All the while, the white majority, the ruling class, is the minority in the area. So kind of setting the scene for what this looked like back in the day. When the French colonists first got here, it was predominantly men, and they were merchants and sailors and magistrates and soldiers, etc. But they were men, and they were lonely. So they found the women that were here already, and many times would capture them and enslave them, as they did many other members of the family, because that was sort of the way at the time they would enslave the native population, and took the women as their bedmates, and had some offspring from this situation, but it wasn't a consistent, fluid thing for them because the population just wasn't there. Also, there were massive food shortages at the time, and so these French colonists who were trying to set up a very firm, powerful French authoritative spot were starving and had to move into these Native American villages to get help from the Native Americans to feed themselves. So this is really early when they first are settling into the area. And then they decide, okay, we need some food, we need some help. But they weren't going to do it themselves, so they decided to import massive group of slaves to provide their food and whatever else they needed. And unlike in a lot of other areas in the U.S., the slaves had a sense of autonomy, not out of altruism for the French, but out of slovenliness. They couldn't feed themselves, so whereas other people would feed their slaves and clothe their slaves, the French couldn't afford to do it. They had no food, they had no means to do this, so they just put it upon the slaves to do this for themselves, which in turn allowed a bit of autonomy. They were able to farm for themselves and do things on their own, actually able to, on occasion, pass work hours, rent out as laborers and make money. And buying freedom was actually possible in the French and Spanish era of colonialism in the New Orleans area, which it wasn't in a lot of other spaces throughout the United States. And also during this time, when the French had taken a lot of Native American slaves, they were still enslaved when they brought in the African group. But the Native American slaves were really good at escaping because they knew the land really well, much better than the French did anyways. And so they were able to escape and either escape back to their villages or just kind of start their own little communities out in the swamps and bayous. And this became an area for Africans to also escape and join these communities. By, I think, 1900, they say that if you're walking through the French Quarter, you would often see Native Americans walking around as well. But by 1900, this had kind of disappeared because most of the Native Americans had been absorbed into the African American culture through a lot of intermingling and intermarrying that mainly stemmed from this slave sort of commingling that they had together as one group. Let's see here. Oh, but again, it was different than in a lot of other spaces in the U.S. because the men were still having many relationships with women of color, Native American and of African birth, or born in the U.S. Of African parents. And it was dependent upon what he thought, the individual, as to whether his child would be a slave and his, partner would remain a slave, or if he wanted to bring them into not necessarily a family situation, but plaçage was very common at the time, which was a sense of like a mistress, where there was definitely not a marriage, but there was a love relationship and a certain sense of comfort given to the woman and children that were born from that relationship. But during all of this time, voodoo was fairly out in the open, or at least it wasn't as closed in as it had been before. During French rule and continuing into Spanish rule, the Code Noir continued to, which was the Black Code, continued to govern what the population, the slave population, and the free population of color were able to do in New Orleans area. The three main things that do with religion were they had to have a Catholic baptism. They were not allowed to worship and serve any other religion, and they had Sundays off as a time of rest. That last one was the only one that was really enforced. And that's where we see in the Place de Negres, Congo Square, Armstrong Park, what is now, there were markets on Sundays where the slaves on their day off would go and gather and sell foods and make music and dance and just have a very social space where there was commerce going on. And just like, you see people dancing in the quarter now and people giving tips, this was done for these slaves that were dancing in La Plaza de Negres. This is what Antoine Simon was saying when, you must come see them dancing in the square, these voodoo rituals. This is a must-see attraction if you're coming to New Orleans. But as time went on, voodoo became thought of as a bit more subversive and worrisome, and a lot of that had to do with the Haitian Revolution. In 1791 and through 1803, the Haitian Revolution occurred on the island of Saint-Domingue at the time, now Haiti. The French were overthrown by their slaves. It's the first black-led republic, and it is rumored to have begun with a voodoo ritual that just stirred up the group to rebel and became this sort of rallying cry, and is still a very big part of the folklore in Haiti. This tampered with a lot of the freedoms that many of the slaves were given in the New Orleans area, because news of this revolution and the rumors that it started with a voodoo ritual were very much produced a lot of fear amongst the slave owners and the French and Spanish colonists in the area. But in 1809, after the Haitian Revolution, over 10,000 people from the island fled to New Orleans, including about 3,000 slaves, which doubled the population of New Orleans at the time. So not only is there this bed of New Orleans voodoo that existed and had been cultivating on its own, but now there was an influx of Haitians who had brought their own version of voodoo, and these have melded into what is now New Orleans voodoo as opposed to what was. It is constantly mutating and becoming new things as new things are introduced to it. So, and because of that, or because of the revolution and the worries continuing, voodoo became more subversive and had to go underground a lot more than it had been. So they canceled a lot of the ability for people to congregate, people of color to congregate, and they were no longer allowed to worship in these sort of styles, so they had to leave the city and go out onto the lake. And they had a yearly ritual, because it was difficult to get all the way out there, on St. John's Eve, which is June 23rd, and they would go out there and have very large, big ritual, but it was still very much known, even though it was underground secret. The railways had extra trains going out there, and they published it, and the
Secret.
yeah, and they would send reporters out there to report on it. So it was subversive and secret and mysterious, but it was also part of creating New Orleans' destination image as such. Through all of these, through all this time, voodoo has remained like a form of resistance during this time. Just the practice of it was going against laws set in place saying that it was not allowed. And it was also a source of empowerment. Women especially were able to become empowered through this religion. Marie Laveau gained great notoriety, respect, and a fair amount of money during the 1800s when she lived in New Orleans. And for a woman of color to obtain this was not an easy task. And some credit voodoo as being part of that. She is known as the Queen of Voodoo, the Queen. At the time she was a queen of voodoo, but she was very much a part of the popular lore and has remained so. And she is often thought to be the one who brought commerce into voodoo and made it an economic source of economic advancement, which during slavery meant potentially buying your own freedom. So that was really important. But along with Marie Laveau, there were lots of rumors that essentially fed what was her power. One of the things that she was thought to control for a little while was yellow fever. Yellow fever from the early 1700s had numerous epidemics in New Orleans area and killed thousands. Because it came at about the same time as the African slaves did, people associated yellow fever with the Africans coming in. Between 1817 and 1905, it killed over 41,000 people in the New Orleans area, which, considering the population numbers during those times, was just massive. But also during the French Revolution, the soldiers that were sent, or the Haitian Revolution, the French soldiers that were sent in to help quash the revolution, a majority of them died of yellow fever. So there was another sort of rumor circulating around that possibly voodoo was responsible for this yellow fever. And people didn't understand how it was transmitted. They knew it wasn't transmitted through proximity because people were near one another all the time and not catching it, but there were still massive outbreaks. People thought it was maybe a hex and there was magic involved. And especially Marie Laveau was a nurse, and nursed several people, or probably hundreds of people, who had yellow fever during the time and never contracted it. And that also sort of added to her allure and mystere as potentially having some control over the disease. But this rumor and sort of power that it gave her was also added to the aspect of resistance that was able to be combined with what voodoo meant in the popular imagination during the time. But above all, Marie Laveau was, to me, she was a visionary and an entrepreneur. She was able to practice her religion in a way that made her money. And in a time when all of this was bad news, as far as the dominant culture was going. She had her obituary in the New York Times. I mean, these are very atypical and special moments for the time. And I don't know if you've all been to her tomb, but she is highly celebrated still. People leave things at her tomb. And I don't know if I can buy the statistics on this, but some people have conjectured that it is the second most famous tomb in the U.S. behind Elvis. Elvis is the only one getting down. That's pretty cool. But also, voodoo came about in popular culture, and that's how most people know about it. In the 1930s, White Zombie was the first movie where voodoo was introduced to the wide public. It was also during the Great Depression. It was a horrible time for people. They were competing for jobs. Not only were white men competing for jobs with machines because of the Industrial Revolution, women had just received the vote and were working also, so, as well as people of color. So they were, whereas white men once had a very solid position in society and were guaranteed jobs above others, this was no longer necessarily the case. It was often the case, but it was not necessarily the case. And there was a lot of anxiety about that. And you see some of that coming through in White Zombie. You have the white, the main protagonist of the film, I don't know if y'all are familiar with it, is Bela Lugosi. He plays, his name is Murder Legendre, which again, my French is horrible, so, which in my mind, when I look at it, it's murder religion. So, but he is a plantation owner on an island in the Caribbean. We're not sure which one, but it kind of hints that it could be Haiti. And he is just a horrible, ruthless sugarcane plantation owner, and is in the habit of making zombies of his slaves, which this is sort of, an apt metaphor, the zombie and the slave in this sort of situation, because we see later the zombie character being brought into popular culture as representing sort of, not necessarily a complete helplessness, but an inability to take yourself out of the position that you're in. And so it sort of served as a metaphor there as well. But he decides to help out this other white plantation owner by helping him get the lady of his dreams. But in order to get the lady of his dreams, she has to be made into a zombie. And so he goes, and then Murder Legendre decides, oh no, I'll take her for myself. And so she's his zombie, and he takes her. And the only one that this, heart sick guy can go to is a priest, because this member of, the Catholic Church, the white man on the island, is the only one with the power to beat the voodoo that is, keep.
How did we miss this movie? You'd have us all on the edge of our chairs. We should have brought a film with you. Yeah.
I know, it's well, it's
We'll have that another time.
Anyway,
White Zombie.
Yeah, White Zombie. And so and it turns out that the only ones he's able to turn into zombies are women and people of color. It doesn't work on white men.
Thank goodness.
Yeah,
Another close call.
How do you explain Midwambi then?
Oh. I'm sure zombie apocalypse.
She hadn't gotten to the 21st century yet.
And so, we see this as a metaphor and representing a lot of the anxieties that the white man is having during the Great Depression, during this time. Also, and then the next year, we have, what is insinuated to be voodoo again, preaching, major motion picture with Emperor Jones. But in this case, it is an African-American, Paul Robeson, who has fled the U.S. and has convinced some islanders, I don't know what island, but it could be Haiti, that he has magical powers and is only able to be killed by a silver bullet. So he is able to gain power over this group, and but then they turn on him and they think, oh, maybe we can get him if we get him with the silver bullet, which they indeed do. And you hear the drums and the dancing, and it's very scary. And when they're coming to get him at the end, and this kind of represents more of a retribution sort of angle within sort of a larger picture, that the person who has been subjugating a people, because he definitely was Emperor Jones and subjugated his people, that the people who had been subjugated would come out against the people who had been subjugating them. All the time, the U.S. is occupying Haiti. So there's definitely this link to Haiti in the minds of the popular audience there, thinking about Haiti. And also at the same time, Jim Crow is in full force. So there's this racialization with voodoo and picturing it as this subversive force that is either going to take away jobs or is going to inflict some sort of retribution upon white man. This continues on with I Walked with the Zombie, which is another great one, where there's the kind of, but this is the first one where religion actually enters the picture. In this one, it is voodoo is actually the religion that they are practicing, and it is a religion and has power as a religion. So there is finally a legitimization to the religion, and it gains some power here. The last sort of blast from the past movie, these are just the ones that I'm going over because they kind of solidified the zombie genre, but also brought voodoo into the popular imagination. It's called Revenge of the Zombies. And this is largely a Nazi Germany movie, sort of. But it's definitely the Axis against the Allies' power. But there is a German scientist in the swamps of Louisiana creating zombies for Hitler's army. So there's, again, this association with something that's pejorative linked to voodoo, even though it has now just become a zombie character as opposed to the link with the religion. And we see this kind of continuing on. When I was looking back at the Scooby-Doo episodes that first informed my knowledge of voodoo, it was always it was used as something scary to scare off all the people so that they wouldn't find out that there was a crime being committed. And then, they would rip off the mask and, oh, there's no such thing as voodoo. This is, just Farmer Bob trying to steal so-and-so's gold from the mines, whatever, the case. But there were several of them. It wasn't just one Scooby-Doo voodoo episode. There were a number of them. And they actually continue on today, and they have gained, or are portraying voodoo now as a more legitimized religion and actually as a religion. And where the sort of heroes, the people who are being, swindled in the tale, are the ones who are practicing voodoo and are sort of the heroes of the time. So there has been sort of this switch of the way voodoo has been represented in Scooby-Doo. Hopefully that'll be an indicator. But if we look at the movies of the 70s, 60s and 70s, whenever voodoo was involved, it was also linked with crime in some way. Like 007, I know it's been in the news a lot lately, and there's a new movie coming out, Live and Let Die. Voodoo is definitely just associated with blackness and crime in this movie, and Baron Samedi is a character in it who is not an evil and malevolent being within the voodoo cosmology, but is sort of the leader of the Gedes, who are to be granted a raucous group of spirits. They are like ancestor spirits, but they tend to want to have a good time when they come back amongst people and and visit. But he definitely was not into any murderous plots as such. So that is kind of where voodoo sort of derived and has come into sort of some popular culture accounts, which has made a large part of what I studied. And I know that we're running low on time, so
We're good.
I just want to open up for questions, if anybody has any questions.
So it turns out that studying cultural studies is an excuse to go back and see old versions of Scooby-Doo shows.
I gotta tell you, my partner, when I was doing this, I would be at home working, and he would come home, and I was watching Scooby-Doo. And he's like, "Wow, you're working hard." You do what you gotta do.
Where do you think voodoo is today?
I think it's taken a very sort of different space. I think it's still within sort of this form of resistance, but I no longer see it as denigrated as it had been. I mean, there's definitely the Hollywood sensationalized versions that you can see throughout the quarter. But there are a lot more opportunities to learn about the religion and to become involved with it than I'm sure there were a long time ago when it was outlawed, for instance, or not specifically, but in practice.
Do you think anybody really practices it?
I think so. I know people who I'm pretty sure are legitimate in their practice and belief system as much as anybody else with any other religion. Definitely.
We had heard when we were, during the 11 days we've been here, that voodoo wasn't always for darkness. It was
No.
also for light.
Oh, absolutely. No, it was always for light. It was just, it could be used for darkness in a way to gain power. And I don't mean that in a way to inflict pain upon somebody, but in order to personally gain power. If you were able to summon the power of, the Loa to you, if you were able to gain some sort of power, and this may be because other people think that there is some sort of black magic, hexes, horrible things going on, that is still power. That is a form of power, and it was the form of power that very few were, they had access to very little power during the time, during, the 1700s when they were enslaved. So potentially having these rumors bandied about that suggested that voodoo was evil and was hexes and could kill all of your cows or whatever it could do, these could be used to, garner some sense of power for individuals.
Was New Orleans voodoo ever connected to voodoo around the country?
Absolutely. I mean, people will definitely say that New Orleans is sort of a hub for voodoo in the United States. It's not largely practiced in small towns in Arkansas, for example, but
That's a good thing.
well, I don't know if it is or not, but there is definitely a voodoo community in the Brooklyn area, and there are some in the Bay Area as well. And definitely there are sister religions like Santeria and Candomblé and Shango that definitely are from the same gene pool, I guess, as you would say. Like, they all were African-derived religions that came about through the course of slavery.
What about Florida?
I'm sorry?
Florida.
Florida, that's large. There is a Voodoo presence there, but there's a larger Santeria presence. So it often gets kind of hidden behind that or absorbed into it popularly.
So there are a large Haitian population in Florida.
What's that?
Large Haitian
There is.
population in Florida.
Let me,
Is that
let me
right?
preface my remarks by the fact that last week they celebrated 200 years of Treme, which is, some people say it's the oldest black community in the United States. But a good friend of mine said that it was the second oldest. But we're not going to split hairs on that. But there's an old African proverb that says, you know, that the story is not told until the hunter tells his story. And what you had just said, obviously you put a great deal of effort and time and the research on there. And it's just like there was this guy a couple of years ago who wrote about the, you know, the big slave uprising down the river. But
Right.
actually, the work had been done by Leon Waters maybe 10 years ago, and this guy Dan Rasmussen, he kind of but I'm trying to figure out the word anyway. He came in later on and he made a big thing out of it. But the whole essence of it is that we're all in this together. You know, see, in America, it's a little bit of a fabric, and we come from all kinds of different places, and which has made us what we are. But it's actually Voodoo, which came from the cosmology of the Yoruba people.
Right.
So, and you mentioned Santeria, which is more or less the Cubans, and then the Congolese, which is Brazil. Now, Brazil has got the largest black population outside of Nigeria, and that's where the Yoruba people are from Nigeria. And it's interesting because you had mentioned also about no written records. There was a historian who had written years ago under the auspices of the WPA, which is Marcus Christian, who did this whole thing down in the French Quarters about, a lot of people think the French Quarters is French, but actually it's Spanish. And a lot of that ironwork down there was done by black people because there were a group of black people that were brought here, and I have
To
a
do
problem.
skilled trades.
Yeah, it would,
Absolutely.
especially with indigo, with the dye making, ironwork, and the whole thing about like this New Orleans culture, like banjo, gumbo, okra, are all Bantu words. And then the Congo square, that's Congo. Then Angola is from Angola. And then Melrose Plantation has the Yoruba House, which is a replica, is directly across from City Hall. So we're all melded in together, and it is funny that one of the things, I don't know if you're familiar with, is Jason Berry's book about the intermingling between the African Americans and the Indians, and that was the Black Hawk Church. Is actually, there's one that still is in existence right off of Elysian Fields. But a year or two ago, I took a trip across from New Orleans to LA, and I grew up in San Antonio, so I never went out to West Texas. And when I got out to West Texas, was going across the Pecos, they were starting to talk about the people who tracked down Geronimo. And it was really funny. They were black Seminole trackers who could tell if somebody had been to an area maybe 3 months before. But in the great American tradition, once they had tracked down Geronimo, what did they do? Put their black ass right back on the reservation. So it's a good presentation. It's very interesting, and I was corrected maybe about 8 or 9 months ago by someone that I have a great deal of respect for, and because since Katrina, there's a lot of people that have come in here to New Orleans, and my thing is that they're trying to tell us what our culture is, and I said they're in New Orleans, but they're not of New Orleans. However, it was David Simon that corrected me. He says he has standing, and it's like you have standing. You know?
Thank you.
You know? And there's a lot of people that they may not have been in New Orleans a long time, but they are contributing something to make this place come back, so I applaud them for their.
We cast a spell on her though and kept her here, so.
There you go.
I'm here for the long haul.
What's your take on Haiti looking to join the African Union on religious grounds?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the first part.
What's your take on Haiti looking to join the African Union on religious grounds?
Gosh, I haven't really thought much about that. I don't know. Hadn't really considered an opinion one way or the other.
Do you feel like, just from studying it, do you feel like the native religions are similar enough to what has developed in the Caribbean to count?
No, I think that they're very different religions. I think that there are bases of one and the other, but I mean, if you look at sort of, I don't know, the Quakers or some sort of group that was a Christian group that came about in the U.S. and then Roman Catholicism, they're definitely very different versions of Christianity. There is an underlying theme there, but I wouldn't necessarily consider them the same, and that they obviously have to go together because of that. But I definitely wouldn't say that they shouldn't go together because of that either.
Let me jump in again real quick.
Yeah.
The greatest practitioner of voodoo now in this city is Sally Glassman, who's a Jew.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
there you go.
And a neighbor.
Who all did you interview in New Orleans?
Ooh, I interviewed probably, I don't know, I want to say about 40 people. So I interviewed a lot. But I did interview Sally Ann Glassman, Ava K. Jones, Brandy Kelly, Andy Antibus.
Brenda Marie Osby?
I'm sorry?
Brenda Marie Osby?
I did not. I didn't meet her.
Okay.
What else did I do? Gosh.
A whole bunch of people.
Yeah, a whole bunch of people, sorry.
Did any of them strike you as authentic?
Yes, definitely. I gotta say, the best, I wanna say the most authentic, as it were. Although I think they were all very sincere in their beliefs. Ava K. Jones is just, she just lives it and exudes it. I mean, she just is a voodoo priestess, and that's who she is. And she's a hoot and awesome. But I definitely, and it's something that she grew up with, and it wasn't something that she came to later in life, if that's kind of where, you know, people's definitions of authenticity come in. That wouldn't necessarily be my definition of authenticity. But if you were to take that sort of view, I think that, you know, she grew up in the tradition and has remained with it and taken it on as a large part of her life.
There's some question coming up here that I,
Well, I just wanted to make a comment about something you said about the empowerment and control. When you stop and think about all religions today, that's really all they are about. They aren't really about God, they're not about embracing spirituality, they're about control, domination, and power.
I don't disagree at all.
They're not about, you know, spirituality is one thing.
Yeah. But
Religion
no, a
is
lot
another.
of, yeah, formalized religion is about power. I
There's a
mean,
question.
they have hierarchies. Oh, I'm sorry.
Well, I mean, it's kind of related to that. We're throwing around the category of religion pretty easily. How do we understand what is a religion? And then it seemed like in your presentation, voodoo changed the perception from something less formal into a religion. And so how did that happen?
Well, my definition of religion is fairly loose also. I see it as a way that a person or a group of people sort of structure their lives and the sort of underlying belief system that goes upon that. And so if you were to take it as that, then voodoo, and also in my opinion, voodoo from its first practice, from the first person saying, you know, some sort of chant of a ritual or doing drumming and drawing upon the spirit, that was religion happening right there. Voodoo has never been a heterodox religion. It's not been one that has a book that, you know, you adhere to, like a Bible or a Torah or, you know, any sort of text that defines what it is. And I think that that's why it is so sort of difficult to pinpoint, because it doesn't have a precise, specific definition, and it is a lived religion. So it is one that's constantly changing and evolving with, you know, additions of new people into the practice, new technology, new just anything and everything that comes about in everyday life. So, I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, I mean, it just seems interesting, like I get the power and dominance thing about all categorically saying that about all religion, but right as that seems to be perceived as an actual religion, as Rightism was subversive.
Yep.
And religion, while there is the power and dominance on one end, the other end of the spectrum is the subversive element that challenges the local politics
Right.
and the local power structures. And so I was just kind of interested in that relationship between, oh my gosh, here's this religion, and now it's subversive.
Right. I think my take on that is that a lot of it had to do with sort of the paternalism that was inherent in a lot of slaveholders' ideas regarding slavery, that if they thought that it was that what their slaves were doing was actually religion, wasn't just, you know, sort of dancing and horseplay and merriment making, because, you know, if they're dancing and singing, doesn't that mean they're happy in slavery? Which was, you know, one of those horrible, horrible things that bolstered slavery for such a long time. And that same sort of paternalism that, you know, they're childlike, they don't know we're trying to civilize, and that if they acknowledged that there might be some political strategy, that there may be some really complex strategies and concepts going on through their practice, that they would have quashed it in a heartbeat. But they, one, probably did believe in that paternalism, and two, it would negate that paternalism that they had built slavery upon, that if they acknowledged that. And it was only once they saw with the Haitian Revolution that something like that could happen, that it became more legitimized as having that sort of power of revolution. And it was also during the time, during the French and Spanish, colonialization, when they had the Code Noir, which sort of oversaw what all people of color could do in their municipality, but they were allowed to practice voodoo and any other sort of social activities they wanted in Plaza de Negres on Sundays. However, whenever there were slave revolts in nearby areas or on plantations, those activities were canceled, and they were quashed by local authorities. And any sort of gatherings of, you know, more than 3 or 4 people of color would be broken up for fear of different uprisings. So it kind of like ebbed and flowed and that sort of thing.
Thank you.
You mentioned at one point that after the Haitian Revolution, you get this, you know, sort of infusion of new people into the city with new ideas about religion. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what kind of historical evidence there is about what changed. You know, how did those beliefs become syncretic, or how did they inform one another? What was it like before, and what was it like after?
There's not historical evidence.
I bet you looked.
Oh, yeah. I looked everywhere I possibly could. No, because it's largely an oral, or at the time especially, it was an oral tradition. Many of the practitioners were not literate, and the observers of the religious traditions didn't consider it worthy of note other than, oh, it's so interesting to see them dancing, and it's a must-see attraction, and you have to do this. Sort of thing. There wasn't any evidence though. It's my surmise.
Got a question in the back
Yeah.
here.
I've been trying to learn more about the history of healthcare in New Orleans, and I'm curious about, and I'm sort of delving into, just beginning to delve, try to learn about like the history of pharmacy here, which is so fascinating, and so Western medicine, but also I'm curious, sort of to hear you speak about anything you came across that's related to voodoo as healthcare and as healing.
Absolutely.
So not, and I know that's tricky because it's like, well, what's spiritual healing? And at first I was like, oh, I'm interested in mental health, and it was like, well, it's all related. But yeah, I'm just curious to hear you talk about voodoo as healthcare.
Definitely. Well, like I said, Marie Laveau served as a nurse, working like in the Presbyterian Cabildo buildings now, where they had just like, or I can't remember which one, but over there where there was an infirmary of people with yellow fever, and she had a greater knowledge of the of local herbs and sort of the pharmacology associated with the local flora because of the associations with the native populations, with the way that the African and Native American populations were commingling and intermingling to such a large degree that they learned a lot about the local plants from them and were able to use them medically to assist in healing. But specific healing things, I know that there are some books out there, but it wasn't something that I specifically was focused on.
Was anyone that you interviewed who's alive today practicing, have that as a focus?
They definitely practice healing. I'm not sure that they would consider it physical medical healing as much as spiritual, sort of psychological healing. But yeah.
What was that relationship between Jackson Square and Congo Square?
Going back to one of those papers that I did a long time ago. Jackson Square was the headquarters of New Orleans. That was where the church was, it was where the military was, it was where the government seat was of New Orleans. And anything major that happened in New Orleans happened in Jackson Square, including trials, weddings, baptisms, hangings, you name it. All the big things happened in Jackson Square. Congo Square, however, was La Plaza de Negros. That was the plaza for the Black Plaza, as it was, I guess, translated into French. And it definitely didn't have the municipal support that a central space would have. It was definitely sort of, and the illusion that I made in a previous paper talking about sort of the spatial relations of Jackson Square and Congo Square was, if you look at the French Quarter, just outside of the French Quarter, across the street on Rampart is where Armstrong Park is where La Plaza de Negros was. So that was out of town, was considered out of town. This was the city, and that was out of town. So we had the hub of government and religion and power in town, in the center, where everything happened. And then we had this space that was where the slaves made merriment and sold their wares and were relegated to be there. In this other presentation I gave regarding spatial relationship, I used a metaphor saying the back of the bus. That voodoo was essentially given the space at the back of the bus, whereas Catholicism, we see St. Louis' cathedral is still beautiful and upright there. That was sort of the hub and the front seat of the bus, whereas
Well, Jackson Square was Plaza de Arms. So
Plaza de
that's
Armas,
where
yeah, military.
Military parade ground was. so.
Exactly.
Other questions? These are all such, who would have known? What great questions. Okay.
I was curious about, you talked about sort of at a number of different times in history, the popular perception and tourist attraction quality that voodoo had, and it seems like specifically in New Orleans more than other parts of the country. And I was curious both if there was, if in your research it seemed that was actively promoted by anybody, and if so, was it by practitioners or tourists? And did that change over time?
Yes. Well, it was definitely never actively promoted, voodoo practice, rituals, et cetera, never promoted by the practitioners to a larger audience as a must-see attraction. It was amongst a literate, wealthy audience, which during the time, 1700s, if you were literate, you were wealthy. You were buying a book that told you all these things. So that was definitely not as so much as a self-promotion. Marie Laveau definitely offered her services up to many people and put on a bit of a show for St. John's Eve out on the bayou, and would, often look like she was coming out of the lake, and she was overseeing these rituals, and there definitely was a tourist attraction sort of spin on that. There's no evidence that I could find saying how people became aware of these events out there. But if you look at a lot of the just history that's out there, records and newspaper clippings, there you can see where there's definitely an upspin, and it's sort of in the mid-1800s where there's a pickup of stories about voodoo, and it's not just sort of a crime beat report about breaking up a voodoo ritual. It turns into, oh, we went to see this lavish, orgy of people out, doing these mystical things out in the swamps. Sort of very reporter, journalist, story-driven articles that start popping up in the Picayune. But then once after emancipation, and I would say up until about the Industrial Revolution, sort of like the 1890s, that stuff was still kind of going on to a certain degree, and I don't know who was publicizing it, other than like the papers were definitely publicizing but not in a way that said, get your tickets now. But more in a way that said, our intrepid reporter ventured out into, and here are the timetables of all the trains that can take you there too.